Thanks, Graham, and good to continue to be with you, everyone. 2 years into this journey, and in some ways, it feels like, how has it been 2 years already? And in other ways, it feels like it's been about 5 or 6 years, depending on your perspective. But on behalf of everybody at Fuller, we've really enjoyed being able to journey with you for these last couple of years. And I'm back again, and I've brought a friend who some of you have actually met before. So Lisa Hanley is part of the Fuller Youth Institute team as well. Lisa is now on staff at the Fuller Youth Institute, and she had just come on staff the last time that she shared at the beginning of this cohort. The conversation that we're going to have for the next little bit is on how to maintain disciplined attention for the long haul. So as you wrap up the cohort process, how do you continue to stay focused? How do you continue to pursue next steps? And the reason that I wanted Lisa to share here, and she'll share for a bit, and then I'll add a few additional comments, is Lisa's not just approaching this from a research perspective, although she can certainly do that as well. She is approaching this as someone who's led this process in her own church over a number of years. So she's been where many of you have been as a staff member or as a volunteer. I did mention that she does work with the Fuller Youth Institute now, so she's still involved in these processes, but I believe it's now as a trustee or board member at her church, which I'll let her share a little bit more about. So Lisa, welcome. And if you can, for those who are new over the last couple of years or have a hard time remembering 2 years ago, because that was quite a while, Lisa, can you give us a little refresher who you are, what's important to know about you, and then would love for your advice. What have you learned from being someone in a real church in the trenches on what it takes to maintain disciplined attention?
Yes, I am in a real church, not a theoretical one. Hi, everybody. I'm Lisa. I was with you 2 years ago, so it's kind of fun to bookend your experience. I started working at FYI in 2020, but before that, I was, like Jake said, a pastor at a local church. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area in California, so I just finished lunchtime over here. But I was primarily the youth and student pastor, but I also ended up overseeing family ministries and was part of our team. I was kind of an associate pastor by the end of our time, depending on how you frame church leadership. So I was involved in a lot of levels with all the things that you're talking about with Growing Young and church culture and change. And so I led our Growing Young team back in 2016 and kind of continued the process for a good 4 or 5 years before I came over to Fuller Youth Institute. But like Jake said, I continue to serve at that church. I stayed there. I'm still both a youth group volunteer and mentor to the current youth pastor, as well as an elder or a board member as of this year. So still very much involved in helping to see these things continue on in our church. And along those lines, the two main things I want to share about maintaining disciplined attention is how to integrate this long-term into the life of your church and your leadership. So whether that's your staff team, like it was for me, primarily it was our staff, but that could be your volunteers, that could be your deacons or elders, whatever your church structure is, whoever the key people are that are leading this effort. It needs to expand and really become part of the life of the wider church and the wider church leadership. If nothing else, because staff people leave and point people, people transition. My entire Growing Young team was gone by 2 years of our cohort for a variety of reasons, not because of issues with the church, just life happens. They moved, things came up. And so it was important that it went beyond any one of us carrying it through, or else it was not going to last. And church culture takes a long time. So the two specific things I'm going to get real practical today because that's how I operate. And as you carried into forward thinking, we need to move from the theory to the practical. So two things. One is to integrate it into your structures or systems with your leaders. So however you talk or work or evaluate kind of ministry in your church life, how can you integrate Growing Young into that? So to give an example of how we did that, like I said, at some point I transitioned into operating more as kind of our campus team lead. And so part of our weekly staff team agenda was how was the Sunday worship service, essentially, which we would often default to the logistics. If you've been in these kinds of conversations, we went through like, did everything go smoothly? How did people respond? Maybe how many people were there? It was very kind of pragmatic. How did Sunday go? But then what we did to change it, to really embody growing young values, was two things. One, I expanded that beyond Sunday to say, what's been happening in the whole week? Because now we can talk about all these wonderful things that I just saw in the chat. What are you doing with your young people? What's happening in maybe small groups or community groups or ways that people are serving in the community? What's happening outside just the worship service, which is only one piece, an important piece, but only one piece of church life. So we expanded to, let's look at the whole previous week of ministry. And instead of just saying, how did it go, which can mean kind of anything, let's really evaluate what matters to us. And so each week I would pick a different growing young value and I would just kind of go around the wheel and say, where did you see that in action? So I might say, where did you see key chain leadership in action this week? Or if you didn't see it, where were there opportunities for key chain leadership and how might you do that differently this week? And so that accomplished multiple things. Like I said, it expanded our view to look beyond just a Sunday service. It also helped us really evaluate what matters to us beyond some of the logistics, as important as those are, but to go a little deeper. And it kept those values fresh. It kept it in our minds. So as time goes on, it's harder to keep these growing young meetings going or however you're operating and really go deep in growing young. So what are some short, simple, ongoing ways that you can just keep it in front of your leadership? And like I said, for me, that was our church staff, but that could be any leadership structure. But how can you just kind of keep that as part of your ongoing rhythm, not just a separate thing, but bring it into the life of ministry and leadership? And the second one is related, which is integrated into your language. So that might be how you talk about ministry, your vision, your theology. But as leaders in the community, there's ways that we talk about who we are as a church and what we're trying to accomplish and what's important to us. And how can you integrate the heart of growing young into your context? And that's where you know your community in a way that we don't, right? Or in the way that the book doesn't know. So to give you some examples of what that looked like for us, growing young as a phrase just didn't really work that well for our community. And I've heard this a lot. I was a coach for a couple of years for other growing young churches as well. And a lot of people said, people have a strong reaction. Like, does that mean you're leaving behind older people or whatever? So instead of saying growing young, we would talk about our efforts to have a healthier church culture, which is the heart of growing young, right? Or to become more of the church we want to be in a place that's for everyone, which includes young people and also includes everybody else, right? So we kind of took the heart of it and said, what's a way that we can talk about this that's easier for our community to receive and to understand and get on board with? Or even more specifically, some phrases really did resonate, right? So I'm pretty sure our pastors still talk about key chain leadership and being a warm community. The idea of warmth and key chains, that really resonated. So that has stuck and been ongoing verbiage for our community. But if you take something like being the best neighbors and that concept, that didn't stick quite as well, although neighboring is coming back into our verbiage now. But at the time, simultaneously, our community was going really deep in this idea of what does it mean to be missional? What is the mission of God or Jesus? And there's kind of a whole movement in that direction as well. And so instead of trying to pull my church and leadership away from this thing that they're really wrestling with and say, no, now let's talk about it this way, I integrated being best neighbors into this framework and language of being missional. But what Growing Young brought to the table was, and we need to think about how that incorporates young people, because a lot of times those missional efforts were all about adults, as a lot of ministry efforts would be. They kind of gravitate towards how adults can do this. So I was still able to champion some of the ideas from Growing Young of how young people can do this, but I used the language and the framework and even the theology that my church was already using. So long way of saying, at the end of the day, what matters are the principles here and the values that your church has been wrestling with and engaging. And so in your leadership structures, in your evaluation, in your context, in your language, in your vision, in your theology, and all these things that kind of make up your ongoing church life, your ongoing church conversations, how can you begin to integrate or continue to integrate growing young so that it can be sustained for the long haul? Because if it continues to be like a parallel thing, as is very common for growing young teams, that's really hard to sustain long term. So I think as you come out of the cohort, if you have like other things going on and growing young, now we want to merge those streams so that they can continue on and that growing young becomes part of your ongoing church life.
Awesome, Lisa. Thanks for that. And we should have a few minutes in just a couple in case people want to ask any questions about what Lisa shared. Well, I wanted you to hear from her experience. I also want to add just a few other practical bits of advice on what it looks like to sustain this momentum. So just a couple other pieces here. And Lisa and I want to be clear, we're not just trying to offer you a list of 5 or 10 things that you have to do every single one of them. You're all veterans. You're 2 years into the process at this point. So you can sort through which pieces are most applicable for you. But we do want to offer that different bits of this are going to connect with different people in different ways. So please take the pieces that are most helpful. One of the pieces I would add, if you're going to maintain momentum long term, I would really encourage you sometime in the next few days to schedule a meeting for your team that is 6 months from now and a meeting for your team that is 12 months from now. Okay, so actually scheduling a meeting 6 months from now and 12 months from now. What's inevitably going to happen is there's going to be some number of weeks or months that you lose energy or momentum related to these topics. And some amount of time is going to pass. Let's say 6 months passes. If you have a meeting scheduled for 6 months from now and you meet with your team and say, okay, where are we at with all this growing young stuff? That becomes an opportunity that you can re-engage the conversation and say, oh, that's right, we need to do some more work on this. If you don't set that meeting, what ends up happening is this will just become one of a long list of things your church has done in the past that you don't think about anymore. So we are not asking you to meet every single week on growing young, unless you want to. You're welcome to do that. But we have heard from many churches simply having a meeting 6 months out and a year out, even for a couple of hours, just to recalibrate, can do wonders. I would use the time during that meeting to ask, are we still headed in the right direction? Do we have the right goals? I would honor the work that you've already done in the last summit, where hopefully you have a vivid description for the future. You have a set of big, hairy, audacious goals. Your work 6 months from now might just be to pull out that same folder and ask, are we still headed in the right direction? Did we, in fact, make progress on some of these things? We do that on a regular basis for the Fuller Youth Institute. We've created our own vivid description for the future. And we do have a rhythm about every 6 or 12 months. We will pull that document out with a group of our leadership and ask, are we still headed in this direction? And there's some times that we realize, no, we've actually drifted a little bit. We need to course correct. Okay, so that's number one, just set those meetings. I can't encourage those strongly enough. The other one, and this relates really to what Lisa was saying about integrating into different things that you're doing. I wonder how you can weave growing young throughout future initiatives that happen in your church. Okay, so Lisa was already talking about integrating. Let's say that the next big thing at your church is around evangelism. Or Lisa mentioned, what if it's about engaging in mission? Or your next big thing is about whatever your next big thing is about. I would ask, how can you make growing young a part of that? One of the key questions that you can ask is simply, how could young people be a part of this? Or how could young people help lead this? If you will look at no matter what initiative that you're going to engage in, no matter what program, whatever is your next big thing, how can young people be a part of this? Means that growing young does not have to continue to be the main thing, but it's always there. there's one church that went through our training. They finished the Growing Young process about 3 years ago. Shortly after, the pandemic hit and they lost focus on growing young. They recently decided to ask as a church, where are we headed overall? What's our strategy? What's our direction? So they brought us in to help them do some listening. And when we spent time listening to the congregation, item number one that everyone was focused on, we need to think about how we engage younger generations, right? How are they going to be part of this? So a focus on young people. But this is what was funny about it. People in the church said, we don't need to do growing young again. We already did growing young. Like, we've done that, but we really need young people in the life of our church. So the way that we phrased it to them is, okay. You already did growing young. Don't do growing young again, but focus on how young people can be incorporated throughout the life of your whole church. It's exactly what Lisa said about the language. Sometimes the language just needs to change, but look for ways to weave it in. Two final tips. Celebrate wins. And this is what you're already doing, whether they're big wins, small wins, just look for signs that progress is happening, but make sure you celebrate those. If you can find ways to celebrate them publicly, those things that get celebrated and talked about, they receive focus and they continue to generate momentum. Here's the very last tip. Look for another church that you can coach or that you can mentor. Now, we're not all going to be a Pamela Kennedy or a Richard Lloyd, right? As much as we may try in terms of our coaching quality, and there's other coaches that I could have mentioned there. I'm not saying you have to become a growing young coach or mentor, but if there is another church that you know of, be in conversation with them about what you've done and how they might be able to do something similar. Often it's in the process of trying to help someone else do this work that it keeps you accountable to it yourself. So again, even not keeping so much focus on you trying to keep going, but find another church who could use this, a friend that you have, someone in another congregation, help walk with them through these concepts and journey, and it will keep you accountable. Okay, we have 1 or 2 minutes. I do want to open it up either for any questions you'd like to chat in, or if anybody wants to unmute themselves. Lisa or I are happy to respond to any other questions that might come up. And Mark, I do see the write-in every year. You have a Big Wins Sunday to create a point where you can give thanks. I love that. I think that's great. Anybody else, questions that you want to ask, feel free to chat them in or unmute yourself. All right, Graham, not hearing anything. Lisa and I are just so grateful to be on for this webinar, to have been able to walk with you, and you all ended up reading and engaging with our book from the US and Scotland. We're looking forward to, over the next few years, all the books that are going to come out of the Church of Scotland that we will be reading, and testimonies of your experiences of what's worked well. So over to you, Graham.
Jake and Lisa, can I just check that I've caught kind of what you said and what I've pasted into the chat just now? So I think the thing for me was that all of those felt doable. They didn't feel so big that they weren't possible. It's kind of, how do we take it on the next stage? As you say, Lisa, how does this become part of what we do and who we are? And the language very much part of that. And just that very helpful practical advice, Jake, of kind of 6 months, 12 months, you can do this. This is not hard. Just put it in the diary just now. If you don't, you'll miss it. And those kinds of things. Have I missed anything there? I caught it all.
Graham, I think you captured it well, and I'll highlight that point that you said. We've looped back to leaders who are several years out of the cohort, and when we've asked them that question, like, what was the moment that guaranteed your success? What was the moment when all of the change happened? And again and again and again, we hear there wasn't a moment. There was not one thing we can point to. It's all of these small decisions over time. So yeah, I just affirm that.